this stuff. I tried. I tried there. Hey, Katie bar the door, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 4Bs. And with a special guest this week, Professor Tim McCarty from that dark and gloomy university known as the University of San Diego. It's a very cheap university, so if you are, if you're looking for kind of a bargain basement university to go to, check out the University of San Diego there. And of course, we have the 4Bs with us. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the revolutionary principle of consent and maybe some other revolutionary principles involved there. But Mr. McCarty, there's one question that's on the tip of all of our, wherever that part of the brain is that's we deal with. By the way, I'm the slow one in the group, just so you're real clear here. But is it true that Professor Williams has the cushiest job at the University of San Diego?
That's a hard question. It's either when they promote him to the president of the university, he will then have the cushiest job. University of San Diego. We're expecting it's only a matter of time, really.
Yeah. That's a good answer. Good answer.
I knew he was aspiring for some higher office. I just didn't know they called him the president there, not the chancellor or something else.
Yeah. Well, when Mike becomes the head of the university, we'll call it Lord Protector.
Oh, okay. It's a little Cromwell there.
Yeah.
All right. So first, can we all agree that it is a misnomer to call the American Revolution a revolution? Can we all just agree that it is not a revolution and that it is a war for independence there? And as the question seems to imply, maybe, as we get into the 1780s, post Treaty of Paris, we have we see some revolutionary form. I saw Professor Moore, you were shaking your head. No, you're not going to agree to that.
Well, I mean, I'm a lover, not a fighter, but I think, you're going to make me go first. All right. It depends. It depends on what they were fighting over. I mean, historians have always wrestled with what were they fighting? Was it a constitutional revolution? Was it a social revolution? Was it even some have said, is there the religious components to it? Was it an economic-driven project? So a lot of it, I think if you configure it certain ways, I would agree to that statement, David, that it wasn't revolutionary. If you want to confine it, literally, I think within more of the constitutional legal framework of the war. So I think I'm with you halfway, maybe, on that.
That sounds like most of my relationships. Professor McCarty, how would you describe what textbooks call the American Revolution a revolution?
I would. I kind of like thinking of the American War for Independence as a revolution. Mostly if we're willing to take seriously, for example, and I'm going to out myself as a political theorist by saying, if you look back at John Locke at his definition of revolution, he says that actually a true revolution is just a restoration to the natural order of things. And so, some folks look at post-French Revolution and say, oh, that's a real revolution. But as of 1776, I think a prevailing understanding of what made for a revolution was the idea of casting off the prevailing order, not necessarily to totally transform the social structure, but to restore a sense of alignment with natural right. And I think from that perspective, it's a pretty clear, a fair definition of revolution as they would have understood it in 1776. And I think that I like that as a way of thinking about it. And I think that, and then you can get the more radical historians, your Gordon Woods, who say that there was true radicalism at the heart of the American Revolution. So yeah, I kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's me as an American. I want to think that we had a cool revolution.
Professor Kavanaugh, what do you think about that?
Well,
This is
I'm trying to-
a Lockean restoration. I'm curious.
I was trying to think of Crane Brinton's stages of revolution, right? You know, all the stages of revolution, and whether or not we checked all those boxes in terms of the political science, in terms of whether or not. And I guess my question is, how would you define a revolution? Is it, you're talking about just the fighting? Or are you talking about changing the mindset? Or are you talking about the Constitution that emerges years later? I mean, I think there might be multiple revolutions within a certain time period. I mean, the Thomas Ricks book, and the Thomas Ricks book that I mentioned before about founding principles, he's kind of won me over to the idea that the revolution happened prior to the fighting. So,
all right. Well, you asked what a revolution is. I'll just quote from Hamilton: "The world turned upside down." And if we want to look at the scientific definition of that, to me, you are literally turning things on their head. England is not as oppressive or tyrannical state in 1775 as, let's say, France and some other European countries. They do have an element of consent themselves, and we'll get into that maybe a little later. But if we look at, socially, there are, women's status is still the same. African American status is still the same. White men without property status is still the same. So there's virtually no changes. Religion in colonial society doesn't change drastically because of that. It will maybe later on. But I look at those, I guess, tangible aspects, and I don't see the revolutionary change, or even the revolutionary cause.
right, those are all fair points, absolutely fair points. But I would go back to that sliding scale of sovereignty, right? And this battle for sovereignty. And now we know, after this revolution, whatever you would like to call it, we know that sovereignty is going to rest for sure on this side of the Atlantic. And where we go from there is entirely up to us in terms of taking these groups that you mentioned. And go ahead, Tim.
Well, I think Dave you raised an interesting point, and I'll pose the question to everybody: does it matter? Because the quote from Rush in this question seems to be a forward-looking. This revolution has yet to unfold, but I wonder about. And because you mentioned this, I think, Chris, did the revolution actually start in the 1760s? Or is it just about, that year 75, 76, when we have a lot of rattle and hum and the fighting's already occurred? But does it make a difference where we identify the revolution beginning as to whether as to whether subsequent events make it a revolution? Does the origin moment matter, I guess, is my question.
Well, I would say, boy, because the origin. What's the origin moment? Is it James Otis? Or is it the Declaration? Is it that
or Declaratory Act, Stamp Act? I mean, there's a lot of options in the 60s.
Right. At what point is the Rubicon crossed? And there's a point of no return. That may be the Declaration. I don't know. There's definitely no going back after that. So I don't know. That's a great question, Tim. I'm not sure the answer.
Anyone else?
How do political scientists answer that? Yeah, let's hear from the political scientists.
Mike, do you want?
Oh, go ahead, Tim. I'll go after you, Tim.
Well, I guess I was curious. I wanted to ask another question, which is, I think how I would want to answer the question depends on what, for the purpose of the conversation, we think is at stake in answering yes or no. So, if we're merely sort of trying to fit it into an analytical frame for the purpose of like comparative politics, then I think then I think that would push us to maybe be a little more hesitant to call it a revolution. But if I think the thing that's at stake is sort of understanding a sort of moment of upheaval from within, then I think we're on stronger footing to call it a revolution. And then I think also, but if we're looking at sort of whether it represented sort of normatively the kind of social transformation that we think might have been due, and this gets to the condition of slaves, the condition of women, the condition of unpropertied white men, then we answer it in a sort of different way. And I guess I'm not sure what's most useful to the people watching this, but I think that's where, at least that's where my head goes in thinking about how I want to think about this.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think we've talked about this before. I think most comparativists, political scientists would not put the American Revolution into the same category as Russia or China, because there we're looking at all the things you mentioned, Dave, happened. I mean, they didn't happen for maybe the better, but there was tremendous, not only political change, but social and economic change that went along with it. So, I mean, Eric Foner makes a pretty strong case that if we're looking for that sort of change in America, it's really in that brief period after the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
During the radical Reconstruction. And it's really, really brief, but that's where you see major things changing in a way that didn't change, as you mentioned, Dave, in the 1770s. So, but to Tim McCarty's earlier point, I think definitely it's a political revolution of sorts. I mean, the notion of how people are thinking, conceiving of their government and the idea of consent and who's going to rule them, I think that changes tremendously.
A political revolution of sort. That's kind of like being kind of pregnant there. Because and here's my problem. So before, all right, 1776, we are governed by an elite group of white males, property owners. After the revolution, we're governed by an elite group of white males. So what's the revolution, when it comes to politics?
Well, I've got one example, and that is when you're voting for people to attend the constitutional convention within your state, right? Property requirements are rescinded. So you have, you can, for white people at least, can go out and vote, right? And plus the fact you look at New Jersey's original state constitution, free blacks and women could vote in their original 1776 constitution. So you do see some changes. Now, of course, New Jersey, in typical New Jersey fashion, goes back and amends that constitution to take those rights away. But originally, I mean, there was some examples there.
And you do start to see disestablishment occur in some of the states after the revolution too. So that I think is significant.
So what are these Professor Tim, what are the revolutionary principles that are set in motion? We're struggling with whether or not the war was a revolution in itself, but the question implies, is I think Professor Moore pointed out, that it's set in motion. All right, revolutionary change. But what would you identify, Professor McCarty, as the revolutionary principles embodied in this conflict with England?
Well, it's so hard, I mean, to think about it as, there's the principles that we can sort of say were sort of motivating action in the purest sense. And then we can think about the principles that got validated by the conflict and by the outcome of the conflict that sort of snowballed. So, you don't have Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass being able to look back at the principles of 1776 and saying, look, you said all men were created equal. Now, the bill has come due. But I don't think it is certainly an anachronism to say that the revolution was in fact fought to establish the principle that all men were created equal. If anything, they kind of inadvertently agreed to something that they may not have, seen the implications of. And that's, I think, a really good example. But I do think, to get back to this issue of consent and what was revolutionary, I think one thing, a spark that was lit in moving from one group of propertied white men to another elite group of propertied white men, was this principle that Americans can expect to be watchful of whether or not they are being substantively represented properly. That the fact of representation, which you know, the theorists of virtual representation said, well, listen, you have representation, that's fine. I think one of the principles that comes out is this notion that becomes a really rapidly democratizing notion, that the fact of representation is not sufficient, and that Americans should expect politically to evaluate whether or not they are being properly represented, whether or not their representatives are, you know, truly from, you know, where they're supposed to be from, the kind of people they're supposed to be doing the things they're supposed to be doing. And this is, I think, a substantive difference, even though, you know, we look back on it and we go, one group of white men, another group of white men, it sort of starts that process in a really important way. I mean, we see the first real flowerings of that in the Jacksonian era, right? When we see the property requirements start to fall, and it continues apace to now, as we are, you know, questioning whether or not our representatives are properly representing us.
You know, I was listening, Professor, to what you were saying, and I was thinking, actually it starts way earlier than that. I think it starts with Shays' Rebellion and the other farmers' rebellions that we see in the States. You see this outbreak of democracy. You see this outbreak of lack of representation. So it's post-war, pre-Constitution, and you see people like, you know, wait a minute, these people at the state level are not representing us what we wanted. And so that made it okay. I think maybe these revolutionary principles, if you will, from '76, makes it justifies their action to say we're going to close down the courts. You know, we have these farmers' rebellions up and down the 13 states. Tim, is that?
Yeah, I think that's where the British really miscalculate. Really do miscalculate the at least rhetorical commitment to small d democratic representation. I mean, even in the middle of the war, they sent up, I think it was called the Carlisle Peace Commission. They sent to the United States, and assuming that they were going to be meeting with some kind of the better sort of Americans, they were going to be reasonable. And that all of that noise coming from those crazy radicals in Massachusetts, which by the way they weren't, but that they could derail this revolution if they could get a face-to-face with the moderates. I think that was 77, 78, and that's a grand and glorious failure. And the British couldn't understand. They just did not grasp. I think, to Professor McCarty's point, they didn't grasp the unleashing of this notion of really more of a small d democratic form of representation.
As limited as it may be.
Well, okay,
Right.
I just want to make sure, being again the slow learner here. So equality is a revolutionary principle that will not, I guess, blossom for a very long time, but it's put into the language of American politics. Consent. Consent is a revolutionary principle here, I guess. You know, Kavanaugh, you said sovereignty, but it's not popular sovereignty. And again, that's where I get kind of, you know, caught up on the revolutionary notion here. If it was popular sovereignty, then I might buy into that, that this being a revolution, but it's really not popular sovereignty, or do you disagree?
No, I think you're absolutely right in terms of like the expansion of the you know, very limited enfranchisement. So yeah, so it's not what I would call popular sovereignty, but it is sovereignty nonetheless. It is power. You know, I think of sovereignty, very simple definition, is power in a particular place. And so what you do, as you do see, you know, I always take that with my students back to Magna Carta. right? All the way back to Magna Carta, because it really becomes a urinating contest over sovereignty. And, does Magna Carta grant all kinds of rights for people? Hell no. But it does plant the seed, much like the American Revolution plants a seed, and we see those seeds slowly come to fruition over time. And we know that, Mike, it doesn't really happen until what year?
1965.
There you go.
Is
64,
I want to. I'm going to feel real dirty here. I'm going to ask a political science type question. Is popular sovereignty the same as voting? I mean, I guess I tend to see it as popular sovereignty is exercised when you create a system. Policy is once the system is created. So I don't see policy making, voting, the same as popular. I know there's overlap, but I guess I don't see them in those stark differences. What do we? What say we?
You're saying the difference between sovereignty and popular sovereignty?
No, the difference between popular sovereignty
And
or
voting.
even consent, or even consent. Does consent mean the same thing as policy outcomes or inputs into once the system is created?
I don't know. I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean,
Okay, that was crickets.
there's
Sorry.
No.
That's a fascinating question. I'm immediately going. I should apologize. Like all I end up thinking about is old weird books to connect these things to, and I think the way that Hobbes talks about sovereignty, and Hobbes says, well, no, sovereignty is only in that moment of consenting to the social contract.
Right.
And then sovereignty is granted to the
Right.
sovereign. And then even if you have a democratic system of government, you're not exercising sovereignty. You're structuring government, but sovereignty exists with the sovereign authority. And Hobbes is usually read as that's a very conservative way of thinking about, that's a very, almost reactionary way of thinking about government. But there's another good example, a 20th century political theorist named Sheldon Wolin wrote this really wonderful essay called Fugitive Democracy, where he argues that that democracy, and by which he means popular sovereignty in this kind of Hobbesian sense, exists in these moments where the people in their collective capacity act in a kind of unruly, extra-legal, disruptive way. And that that's where democracy lives. And that a system of constitutionalism is basically how constitutionalism per se is how we, put the lid on the pot of democracy. And it's only when, the lid gets blown off by democratic action that we see democracy itself. And he connects that with, he says, it's the people in their collective capacity rising up, acting in to grab onto their democratic sovereignty. So voting, peaceably petitioning, these sorts of things are not really democracy, he says. Those are just sort of acting within the norms of constitutionalism. So yeah, I guess I'm inclined to be moved, whether I'm thinking like Hobbes or I'm thinking like Wolin, to say that, yeah, I think that's a fine way to think about it.
So with that argument,
many of the framers were afraid. They always used they were afraid of the river overflowing the banks.
Mhm.
So for many of those conservative, cautious revolutionaries, they wanted to keep that revolutionary fervor contained, because if it got out of hand, you might have people that didn't have property voting, So there was a keen awareness of the revolution spilling over beyond a narrowly confined river channel. They use that analogy quite a bit, the river channel.
Mhm.
so
Mike,
with that
I'm
idea,
sorry, go.
no worries, that fugitive democracy idea, would that mean that both Black Lives Matter protests last summer and January 6th would be examples, according to this argument, as popular sovereignty?
Oh boy, That is such a good question. And like my instinct is like, yeah, Black Lives Matter protests, fugitive democracy. That's exactly what Sheldon Wolin is talking about. And I want to not say yes to the January 6th because I don't like it. But I think that's such a. I'm gonna have to read that essay again, which I've
Yeah.
never thought about doing. But as a sort of, yeah, I mean that. There's a pretty good argument, I think. Again, I'd have to read the essay and sort of his precise. I don't want to put that on Wolin, but in sort of my like folk understanding of his argument, I think that we would have to say, which is why the fear of folks like James Madison about or John Adams for sure of runaway democracy. It's not if Wolin is right about where democracy lives in these unruly moments, then they're not just villains for being a little concerned about it, right? That they had a case that democracy can be this frightening, destabilizing force.
I think it was James Wilson that said the last time the people were sovereign is when they actually ratified the Constitution, and then after that, the Constitution became sovereign. So just throw that in there for the students watching.
Well, I'm curious, could we just narrow this down to the fact of one, the convention and ratification is the expression of revolutionary principles? Is that what it boils down to?
No.
Help me out then.
Well, because I think what you're doing with the convention is you're putting a lid on this. Goes back to what Professor McCarty just was alluding to, because I think what you see is that fugitive democracy happening. That was my point earlier with Shays Rebellion. You see that fugitive democracy coming into play up and down the 13 states, that people are not being represented. So you have these farmers' revolts, and I think that to me is like that's fugitive democracy. And so what you see is guys like Madison and Hamilton and Washington coming in and saying, this makes us uncomfortable. We need to control this.
Okay, so
Woody Holton, for students watching, Woody Holton, Unruly Americans. I'd hold it up, but I don't have my copy handy.
well, so again, trying to understand here. So are you saying that Philadelphia is somewhat of a counter-revolution?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that.
But then we talked, and Tim Moore had said earlier that ratification is, again, somewhat revolutionary because, and I think you said it too, the removal of property requirements and allowing, small d democracy to grow at least temporarily there.
A little smaller d, not completely, still white people, right?
Well, that's the
people with the proper plumbing.
Well, yeah, I think there's a difference between process and outcomes. I mean, certainly the process is a bit more democratic in terms of, to Chris's point, dropping property requirements. But the outcome, this most recent book by Claremont, The Founder's Coup, he makes this argument, Dave, to your point, that it is a counter-revolution to keep the lid on the rampant democracy existing that Horton's book outlays quite well. So yeah, I mean, that's quite a fairly accepted view, David, that it was a counter-revolution. I mean, that was Beard's argument all way back in the day.
And we know that I'm a Beardsian here. So Professor Williams, help me out here. The question is asking students to identify, to what extent, if any, that revolutionary principles guided constitution making in the founding period. I'm assuming they're talking about state constitutions as well as the national constitution.
Yeah.
And I'm having a hard time getting my hands around. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a distinction between the Constitution that was written in Philadelphia, that document. I think there's an argument there that what's in that document is a bit counter-revolutionary, right? But the process after they leave that meeting, I mean, we all know how they came to that meeting. There was no rule that said they should be coming to that meeting in the first place, but they leave that meeting, and instead of having George Washington go up and down 13 colonies and say, this is your constitution, take it, they open up this ratification process, which to me, that is maybe a revolutionary principle. Like, we have come up with this new form of government, but we're going to take it through this ratification process and try to convince enough people like to agree to it, even though they're maybe agreeing to something that is a bit counter-revolutionary. Does that make sense? So the principle is the fact that the people could decide whether they wanted this or not. And we know from the Federalist Papers how serious all these leaders took it. Like, they were really spending a lot of time trying to convince other elites to agree to this, because they felt that was the way that they could get it sort of passed.
But I mean, I want to hammer on process. I mean, the process of bottom-up democracy is fairly prevalent through the revolutionary period. I mean, Pauline Maier makes the argument that there were something like 180, 200 declarations of independence before we had the national one. We had all kinds of local associations during the revolution at a very local level, local committees of order. So there was a lot of democratic bottom-up input into the revolutionary process, as well as a lot of bottom-up efforts before they got to Philadelphia too. I mean, every state debated this, do we send, except Rhode Island, do we send delegates? So there was a lot. I think one of our problems here, I think that we may be stuck with, is seeing this as a nationalist framework. There's a lot of bottom-up localism in play during the revolution, as well as the creation and ratification of the Constitution as well. Does that make any sense? Or, I mean, I hate to be the curmudgeon historian here and hammer on the bottom-up nature of the American Revolution, but.
Well, I think you see that too. And I'm listening to you, Tim, and I got Tocqueville running through my head, right? Even after ratification, even moving into the early 1800s, where this is still a new process for people. And, what he calls us a nation of joiners, and we're going to drop our plows to have a political discussion. So I do think that there is something to be said for that. But again, going back to, for any students that are watching this, it is a very limited term of democracy, still white male property owners.
I do think.
Go ahead.
One thing that I keep thinking about is that, there is one of the interesting things that comes out of the Constitution making process is that to this day, right, we don't mark the birth of the United States at 1787, right?
You don't?
It's
I'm sorry, just teasing. Sorry.
That it's 1776 that sort of matters in the public imagination, and in the way in which I think this is understood as sort of not the sort of the definitive moment, but the end of this process. That we can even go back further, Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, those, the Stamp Act crisis, those sorts of things, and that we say, like, this is a process, but the one sort of moment that we keep coming back to is 1776, which is this sort of revolutionary moment. And the way that this plays out is that the Constitution ends up being pitched in, every radical movement in American history for, toward democracy has pitted the Declaration of Independence against the Constitution. And this way that sort of we can see that in this weird way, the Constitution is sort of in dynamic tension with the Declaration. But there's also something about the fact that, like, in creating the Constitution, we didn't eradicate that sort of spirit of revolutionary principle. Something got in there that could sort of remain and get sort of, it was plausible immediately to look back at 1776 and say, well, we can judge 1787 by the lights of 1776 and find it wanting. And I don't know, that this would be the work of a historian or a clever interpreter of the history of ideas to sort out exactly why that is. But it does seem like, we didn't restart the clock, and that tells me that something of what came before it is in there.
Well, that's the anti-federalist argument that they were the bearers of 76.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Federalists were not. So they invoked, to your point, Tim, they invoked 76 as the true heirs to the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
As do the southern states when they decided to secede.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, I guess I shouldn't just say every radical movement toward democracy, because also reactionary movements against democratization are equally calling that forth, up to and including January 6th.
So I'd like to throw out to the four of you to explain to me, like I'm an eighth grader, the substantive meaning of the first sub-question, and that is, what problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? What is that asking of students? And
if you're an eighth grader, I'll start with Pepe Le Pew and consent, because you cannot force yourself on somebody else without consent.
Thank you, Professor.
I'm trying to be relevant here. No, I'm trying,
okay.
Relevant to
trying to be
Go with Cuomo, for heaven's. Go with Cuomo, for heaven's sakes.
Sorry, I was trying to be funny with Pepe Le Pew. Come on.
I like
Yeah,
that.
how many students are going to catch that today, Chris?
Yeah, Chris, I think you're a little outdated there.
No, I'm sorry. Pepe Le Pew is in the news because he's being canceled by the cancel culture, because he's not in Space Jam 2 because of his ways with cats that walk under white paint. I'm just telling you.
Oh God, what was the question, Dave? What was the question?
Again, I'll be honest. I've spent a little time today trying to look at this question of what problems does the principle of consent present when creating it, and I don't know exactly what's asking students to testify on or discuss. So I want you guys to enlighten me. What do you see as the essence of that question? What is it asking students to be able to know and do?
Well,
I'll weigh in, because go ahead, Mike.
It made me think of the idea of whether we should be governed by the decisions of our ancestors. So like this idea of consent, I didn't consent explicitly. So this notion of what do we do in a democratic republic in terms of reconsenting? And that's more in the amending of the Constitution rather than, I guess, in the creating of it. But that's what immediately I thought about, was just like, why is this document bound to me in any real sense? Because I wasn't around for making the decision whether I wanted it in the first place.
Do political theorists kind of snicker when they read Locke's tacit consent section?
Some of them, for sure. I mean, it's obviously a trick, right? I mean, it's saying
Yeah.
that the tacit consent on some level, although there are not, if, for example, we have been, if I'm giving you a ride to work every morning, right? And when and the first time I pick you up, you hand me $1 for gas, right? And then like you get in the car, and every day you hand me, and I give you a ride to work for a month, right? and you give me $1 for gas every day. You just like hand me $1 and you're like, hey, here's for gas, right? It seems as though, and then if on, after the first month, you get in the car and you don't hand me $1, one might think like, well, do I have a right to, I never said you have to pay me $1 every day for gas. And you never said, I'm going to pay you $1 every day for gas. We just sort of developed this sort of, and it seemed as though to me, Tim's going to pay me $1 for gas every day. And I assumed you agreed to that. And then all of a sudden you stop doing that. I think an open question is like, has something like tacit consent been has something been violated in that, even though we didn't explicitly sit down and agree to this sort of thing? And I think in that way, a lot of our social lives are based on this kind of implicit agreement to each other to do things certain ways. And so I think Locke is deriving something from something reasonable. But I think it also wouldn't, on the same token, I think plenty of other people would say, well, listen, you never agreed to take the $1. He was just being nice for 30 days. And then he stopped. Or maybe you thought, oh, no, I was going to do that for the first month, and then that was going to cover me for the rest of the year. I just didn't realize that those were the terms that you had in your head, and I had different terms in my head. We failed to have a meeting for the minds. Maybe we need to go to court. But so I think that as a matter of sort of justifying political obligation, tacit consent, it's questionable. But I don't think it's an obviously bogus moral principle, I guess, is what I would say. And this is something that political theorists have been arguing about ever since Plato's Crito.
Yeah.
And this is, Mike is giving me a funny look because everybody has to take a drink because I said Plato. And Mike knows that's about me. Yeah. This is the dialogue where Socrates, he's in jail. He's just been convicted of corrupting the youth by the democratic people of Athens. He thought it was garbage. It was garbage. They shouldn't have convicted him for corrupting the youth. He's just going on asking questions. His buddy Crito comes in and he's like, hey, Socrates, I paid off the guard. We can escape. Let's go. And Socrates is like, no, let's talk about it. Let's figure out whether or not it's justified. And one of the arguments that he makes is, well, listen, I spent my whole life obeying the laws of Athens, never leaving Athens. What right do I have now to disobey the laws of Athens that I have clearly, just because things turned out the way I didn't want to, I've clearly kind of implicitly agreed with the laws of Athens up until this point, which, I don't read necessarily the idea of tacit consent into that, but that's I think it's a nugget of an idea that tacit consent is engaging with.
I think that's all about consent. I mean, if the Crito, as opposed to the apology, which is like, hey, I'm Socrates, don't kill me. You're going to lose a really important guy. But yeah, Crito is like, it's all about consent. Absolutely. And that's where you take the good with the bad. And he's not going to vote with his feet or withdraw his consent, right? By leaving. I think that's all absolutely about consent. I think that, I don't know, Dave, I'm trying to think about the original question in the sub bullet or the sub question. And I think what they want the kids to think about is, the limited democracy that was available at the time. How did women consent? How did women consent to this? How did non-enslaved people consent to this? And I think that creates an issue there. So I think that's what they want to get the kids to try to pull apart, I guess. That's my thinking when I look at.
Well, I think knowing a little bit about the background of how that question was created, I think the idea of tacit consent is a big. I think students would be well advised to articulate their feelings on that, or their thinking on that, because that's, I think, to Tim's point, that's a real problem in Locke. At least I've always seen that part of the second treatise as really squishy. And even am I right in remembering that Hume takes him to task on the consent moment too? I think was it David Hume had a real retort to the whole idea to begin with, let alone tacit consent.
Yeah.
Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of Hume's wonderful moments of just looking across at another Enlightenment philosopher and just going, "Oh, come on, that's silly." Which is why Hume is so much fun, because I mean, it's subtextual, but that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
And he's Scottish, so he's a lot more fun.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Professor Williams, you're probably the major influence for me intellectually in this question of legitimacy. Is there a connective tissue between consent and legitimacy in constitutional democracies?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking, but I'm having a slow day, as you can tell.
Yeah, that's okay. You were watching giant baseball. That's definitely a slow day.
Yeah.
Well, again, you've made this argument ever since we started.
Well, wait till
this
tomorrow
process.
when he's watching the Brewers. It gets slower.
Again, you've been arguing since we started this process, Mike, that the American Revolution really doesn't flower till 1964, 65. We can't really call ourselves a democracy until that time. And it leads me to question, well, obviously that has to do with some element of consent or the ability to participate or to consent. And so I'm wondering if, the narrower consent does it make government less legitimate in your opinion?
Yeah, I guess when you raise the concept of legitimacy, I think I brought this up before. I think legitimacy has at least two different parts. I think one part is maybe the process part, which is more of the consenting that, but there's also this notion of moral legitimacy, and that's much more sort of like political culture-y. So it's like this idea that the rules that I'm being asked to consent to, those rules themselves, I find to be the right ones, the ought, right, normative. So for example, in South Africa, with traditional chiefs, there's no voting, and there's no like the community deciding we want this chief, but there's a moral legitimacy that the oldest child of a certain clan will rule. And so that's what gives that system some of its legitimacy. So yeah, I would say consent matters, but it's also, I mean, I bring up 1964 and 65 a lot, and I've been doing some thinking this week about how much the struggle of Black Americans over the last 400 years, how much they have taught us about the morals of our democratic system. They've been telling the rest of American society to live up to these morals, right? So in 1964-65 is this beautiful moment because there's finally this process to where they can now fully sort of actualize to be part of the system and to consent, but it's much more than that. It's like that system that they were wanting to consent to is something that morally they had been fighting for hundreds of years. I don't know if that makes complete sense or not, but so yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, especially, and this is somewhat to what you had mentioned before about the amendment process, is one of the challenges, I was thinking about it. Obviously, we can pass an amendment to the United States Constitution that reflects only a minority of the population. So is that a problem of consent in our system or consent in general?
That's a
And
problem.
that's to anybody.
That's a problem with the Constitution as it's been ratified. I mean, I'm going to go put on my Sandy Levinson hat and be the old curmudgeon and say, this is the Constitution that we have. It can be amended with the minority of the population. So, I mean, that's the process. That's what we have available to us because they put so much emphasis on the states within Article 5. So is that a problem? Well, yeah. I don't think the founders or the framers envisioned the idea that you would be able to amend the Constitution with the minority of the people.
Well, that assumes that the amendment process is the only route is Article 5. I mean, as I understand it, there's even Amar has dabbled with the idea that there's other ways to amend the Constitution other than strictly being bound by Article 5.
Yeah, but my point is, it is possible to amend the Constitution
Yes.
with a minority of the people. Therein lies the issue, where you have, 50 senators represent 41 million more people than the other 50 senators. Therein again, I'm that's a dead horse I've been beating to death on all these broadcasts.
Well, Professor Moore, I don't know if we've heard from you as far as what would you look, from students? What would you look for from students on this question? What would you want to see that they understand?
Well, I would want them to wrestle with tacit consent. I'd also want them to wrestle a little bit with how do you gauge that? What's a consent moment, and what's your criteria by which you, to Mike's point, your question you asked Mike, that moment is a legitimate constitutional moment. So I think I would want to hear students think about criteria by which they would gauge, and it may very well be kind of a policy input, policy output type response. That's what I would want students to wrestle with.
Is it possible? I mean, one of the other ways that I'm thinking about, if I were a student trying to tackle this sort of question and then think about these things, is there a meaningful difference, and is the between expecting that consent is this affirmative yes that is being given to a system, or do we think about consent as not withdrawing consent, right? That the power of consent isn't so much that we give it, but that it is a thing that can be withdrawn. And so in thinking about, so for example, Rousseau's radical social contract says that every meeting of the assembly must begin with the question, do all agree to keep the form of government as it is? Otherwise, it's not legitimate. That that basically every meeting has to begin with, are we abolishing this whole thing? No, we're not. Or, yes, we're going through. And so he, that's how he builds in affirmative consent into every single action that they take. Whereas I think a part of tacit consent is the fact that Locke always holds out. He says, you never lose your right to revolution. You never lose your right to withdraw consent. And so for Locke, it's not so much the power, it's not so much that we are every day saying yes. It's that we need to be mindful that at any moment we could decide to say no, and we are right to say no, and we are right to, cast things off. And that's where the power of consent has real meaning for our politics.
Can I ask a question, Dave? Do we have time for me to follow up really quick?
Oh, of course.
Okay, so I'm wondering then, given that framework, Tim, that you just outlined, so the power to withdraw consent, are we stuck then with an outcome where folks could withdraw consent and consent to an undemocratic system? Are there any guardrails at all with in terms of the moral of this consent framework, or can we consent to depriving people of their rights or an undemocratic form of government?
Is this where we plug in January 6th?
Yeah.
I mean, can we as an empirical matter? Sure, obviously. But is there, this is where I like to emphasize to my students when talking about Locke and his idea of revolution, is that Locke calls it an appeal to heaven. He says that a revolution is, we're casting everything off. When you withdraw consent and you take up arms against your state, you are basically saying, well, listen, whoever side God is on is going to prevail, and that's the sort of realist undercurrent of Locke, is that he says, yeah, listen, it's about who wins that war. Like once you're in a state of, withdrawing consent, and that's why you don't take it lightly. That's why Locke's not worried about, unlike Hobbes, Locke's not as worried about the destabilizing power of the right to revolution, because Locke thinks, well, very few people are going to just put themselves in a state of war against the state for as they say, light and transient causes, right? It's only after a long train of abuses and usurpations that you're going to get this thing happening. And then once you do, it's like, all right, let's see what happens. And so, maybe a Lockean would say something like, yeah, okay, nice try, January 6th. You made your appeal to heaven and you failed spectacularly, and be prepared for all of the consequences that will come to that. And I think from a Lockean perspective, and this is a fairly, I don't know, traditionalist, liberal sort of way, a lot more people should be being held to account for what happened on January 6th, because it was an attempted rebellion. And unless we're engaging in sort of true politics of reconciliation, those who fomented that revolution probably shouldn't be members in good standing of our polity.
Professor McCarty, I'm curious, for, kind of in a historical vein, in what you said about withdrawing consent. Isn't that what the Southern states, weren't they practicing a Lockean perspective? They were withdrawing their consent. And yet, at least in our constitutional history, and from Lincoln's point of view, no, you can't do that. Am I misunderstanding that? Or is it true that the South was really being more true to Locke than maybe the Union?
So this is, all right, this is going to get really, this is something that I'm fascinated in. There are some folks who try to interpret the debate over the South's seceding as whether or not, from like a comparative politics perspective, we should think about that as a secession movement, or whether we should think about it as a revolution. And there are folks who think, there's a book by a guy named Christopher Wellman, who tries to argue that sort of Lincoln is articulating a theory of justified secession and saying that the South is not justified in seceding. And I interpret it differently. I think that the South was trying to articulate a principle that said they were making the claim that they were constitutionally justified in breaking away without being resisted by the federal government. That so, hey, we have a right to secede. We're just leaving this party called the United States. Let us. Lincoln said, not without a fight, which is to say, Lincoln interpreted it as a revolution and said, well, no, if you're withdrawing consent from the constitutional system, you are putting yourself in a state of war with the state, and now it's time for war, and it's an appeal to heaven, and too bad the South was really bad at fighting a war, that's where we end up. So I mean, I think that I would side with Lincoln in saying, yes, the South put itself in a state of war with the federal government, and therefore subjected themselves to the state of war. But this is, of course, why in the South you get this vision of the war of Northern aggression, right? The idea that the South was merely trying to do something that was justified by the Constitution, which is just, hey, we said we want to be a part of it, now we don't want to be a part of it anymore. But the Lincoln conceptualized the Constitution as a Lockean social contract. You break that contract, you're in a state of war, come what may.
So, well, when you say withdrawing consent, what is that in the practical sense? What's that look like? And I know I'm asking a political theorist here, but what does that look like then? If the South isn't articulating, withdrawal of consent to this form of government, then what does it look like?
Oh no, I think that's exactly what it looks like. The South was withdrawing consent, but when you in this at least, and I'm just sort of playing Locke, in the Lockean framework of what it means to withdraw consent, you put yourself in a state of war with the with the prevailing government, and you say, okay, I am going to repel your attempts to compel me to follow your laws. And
So are we going back to a state of nature?
That's what Locke would say, yeah.
Hey, this is the first time I think maybe I understand it. So I'm done. You guys have anything?
I'd like to propose that in addition, I'm not disagreeing with Tim, but I think some of the difference between the South and Lincoln is the South, as you've said, Tim, is thinking about this contractually. But as I'm thinking so much about Lincoln's first inaugural, he's talking in language that's not contractual. He's talking like in a religious sense, a covenantal sense. We cannot, because we're married.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of the disconnect between Lincoln and the South is that they do see, whereas a part of Lincoln's logic it is more contractual at all. It's almost a covenantal religious overlay to his resistance.
Yes, and I was certainly oversimplifying Lincoln's framework in saying that. There's a lot going on, and one of the big questions with Lincoln is how much is he articulating his authentic principles, and how much is he engaging in a rhetorical gambit? Because
Right.
he's got like 4 different audiences that he's speaking to in that first inaugural.
Right.
And he's balancing all of these, and he's speaking in a sort of different voice to different, he's speaking to the South, but he's also speaking to the North, and he's speaking to the assembled, elites of the Union, many of whom were quite happy to let the South go. They said, well, okay, let them go. Who cares? And a big part of his argument was not just telling the South they couldn't go, but trying to persuade the fellow Northerners, like, we shouldn't just let them go. We should be willing to fight for this.
So if we assume that both consent and equality are revolutionary principles, would it be legitimate to argue that, I see history as this ever expanding notion of personhood and, of identity and personhood, going from white males with property to where we are in the 21st century. But it seems to me that we're in another moment of a counter revolution in the sense of identity and personhood and the idea of consent and equality. Is that a legitimate perspective, or do you guys see a flaw in that? And obviously we're talking about, the questions of voting rights, questions of civil rights, when it comes to equality and consent. What are your thoughts about that? First, Professor McCarty.
Well, I would say, my favorite book about the right to vote in America is a book called The Right to Vote by a guy named Alexander Keesar.
Yep.
And he calls it a contested history, because one of the things that he points out is that, like, this was never without contestation, right? That is the permanent reality of the right to vote in America, is that it has always been a fight. And there have always been, forces, the expansionary forces and retractionary forces. And we've had moments of progress and moments of reaction. And I think that, in some ways we're in a, we are, these fights are live to us at the moment, which I think they haven't been, maybe for the, in my lifetime. I feel like this is the moment in my lifetime in which I feel like matters of access to the ballot are most sort of pertinent, even more so than I think in the fallout of the 2000 election. Although that was another moment. But I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that I think that it is qualitatively, in terms of the fight, different than it has been in the past. I think we've always had these opposing forces that we're working with. That's at least my read on it.
Professor Williams?
Yeah, I think we are in the midst of, like you framed it as, expanding notions of personhood and then resistance to that. So I would agree with that, but I would say that the so-called counter-revolution to this, again, for me, in the 20th century, 21st century, the flowering moment of this is the 1960s, right? And then, but the counter-revolution is, it's pretty immediate and it's pretty swift, right? Just like it is during Reconstruction. I was just finished one of Foner's newest books where he just talks about, it's like 4 chapters, right? 13th Amendment, 14th, 15th, and he has this like what happens afterwards.
The second founding. It's called the second founding.
Yeah.
Time.
It's great because it helped me. I don't think I've been playing around with this idea that the Reconstruction period was much longer than what it actually was. When you actually kind of see when the Supreme Court actually is gutting all the Civil Rights Acts and stuff. So anyways, I'm seeing the same thing now with the 1960s, right? In terms of, for personhood to be, for persons to become more fully part of our polity, I believe that happens with a government acting aggressively to make that happen. I think left to our own devices, it doesn't happen. And I see since the 1960s, the sort of philosophy of government for the most part has been to get out of people's way. And with that, we've seen that counter-revolution that we see these moments and we think, oh, we're kind of past it, right? Or, oh, look at these great strides. We just elected Barack Obama, but we're in the midst of the continual rock coming back down the hill. We're just still trying to stop it and push it a little bit. So I would agree with that. And I think that these notions of consent for the students, to just tie them back in, they're super relevant to thinking about where we are, whether you think it's a counter-revolution or not, but just what that means for when we go about our daily lives and buy our coffee and watch our Netflix and deal with stuff, what we are consenting to, what we are as bystanders or not sort of allowing to happen.
Well, in a modern and again practical sense, is our expression of consent predominantly through voting, and that's going back a while to what Tim was talking about, Professor Moore, and that's where I see, for the life of me, I don't know how certain ideological groups out there can get up in the morning and look themselves in the mirror, by opposing, all right, the right of everybody to vote there. So, if indeed voting is an expression of consent there, it seems to me that that there's a large segment of Americans who don't believe in these revolutionary principles. If indeed consent is a revolutionary principle. I'm just curious what,
I think,
go ahead.
Well, I think Benjamin Rush wrestled with some of the things we've been, that your point, David, as well as Mike's point, because if you look into his biography, he's such a fascinating person. He's very, very early on abolitionism. He's very early on female education. He's kind of a gadfly reformer. I think he sees this revolution, its implications into personhood and dignity. I think he really did wrestle with it and had to deal with the backlash against expanding those notions of liberty, freedom, personhood, and dignity. So I might suggest that Rush, from the very beginning, was wrestling with the implications of some of these things that we're talking about. So I don't know that it's, again, I don't know that our quandaries about the meanings of these things and how far that expansion of liberty and dignity is new to us. I think Rush saw the implications of it and really wrestled with it, and had his critics.
We might have lost Tim for a moment there. Are you there, Tim? Okay. Chris, I know you hate to get into presentism, but I'm just curious what you think about revolutionary principles in modern times. Do you see these principles active in modern times?
Well, I hope so. And Professor McCarty said it, and I brought this up before when he's, busting out those quotes from the Declaration of Independence. We don't do these things for lighter transient reasons. There are long train of abuses and usurpations. So was that an idea, the right to revolution, one and done? Does that not apply to Martin Luther King? Does that not apply to Malcolm X? Does that not apply to Black Lives Matter? Does that not apply to Stacey Abrams in Georgia trying to make sure people have access to the polls? I mean, because we can point out this long train of abuses and usurpations continues to this day. To this day, when you have multiple laws on the state level trying to restrict access to the polls, trying to restrict that small d democracy and restrict that consent that people can give. So I hope that those revolutionary principles are alive today, because they might be needed today. When you take a look and see let's face it, and I'm going to get a little political for the students here, sorry, but when you listen to the arguments being made in the Supreme Court, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett asked the person arguing for the state of Arizona why you need to have this piece of legislation in place. And he says the quiet part out loud that we need this because we may not be able to win elections without it. That tells you right there everything you need to know about consent and the right to revolution, which is that if people are going to restrict your access to consent through the polls, then you know what? Then you have the right to challenge that.
Professor McCarty, if you were having a discussion with your students on this question of revolutionary principles in the modern era, what would you want them to walk away with? What would you want them to understand about again this notion of living revolutionary principles in modern America?
I think what I would want them to, what I would want my students to come away with was a sense in which they have the right of inheritance of the American Revolution to be a whole lot wilder and a whole lot weirder in what they imagine is possible for this country than I think that they do.
Come to Madison. Come to Madison.
State Street.
State Street, yeah.
Yeah, that's where that's what I would want them to take away. And I was thinking about, as we were talking about this, I was thinking about, like, there isn't only the sort of collective revolutionary withdrawal of consent. There's also an American tradition of nonconformists finding quiet ways to withdraw consent in all kinds of ways. And, my favorite of these are Thoreau. But, you see this, throughout American history in all kinds of different iterations. And this is a strain that runs through not only American politics, but the philosophers like Thoreau and like Emerson, and in American literature, you see this in Moby Dick, you see this in Walt Whitman, you see this in Invisible Man, and in the works of Toni Morrison. This is in Marilyn Robinson, and I think that's what, all of these, a way to sort of affect a revolution within as a way of resisting what America is trying to do to you. And so that's something that I would hope to inspire in students.
Well, the folks in Northern Idaho would say amen to that, brother, in withdrawing consent and going and living in the mountains, I suppose.
Yeah.
Coeur d'Alene's a beautiful place. If you've ever been there, so it's beautiful.
I always like the great irony that there are so many survivalist groups up around Moscow, Idaho. I love that irony.
Moscow.
Well,
Moscow.
that is a good point in which to bring this to a close. Professor McCarty, we want to thank you for your participation in this discussion on, for me, what is an extremely difficult subject to get my hands around, and you brought me some enlightenment, so I appreciate that. Students and teachers, our next session will be involving Professor Hank Chambers. I believe he is still at the University of Richmond. Is that right there, Mr. Moore?
I'm going to say yes. I haven't heard from him either. So
yeah, I'm still waiting for the response. But we hope we'll have Hank Chambers. And the subject yet is to be determined. So we'll let you know next time we see you, next bat time, next bat place. Peace, love, yogurt tacos. We're out.